This is the 341st meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a series of talks, lectures with cartoonists and people who write about comics, people who think about comics, that was started over a decade ago by Ben Catcher. My name is Austin English. I'm curating this season on behalf of Ben and administering it. And we're very lucky tonight to host Bill Kartalopoulos. He is doing part 2 of his lecture on the history of avant-garde comics. I am going to, in the chat right now, put a link to the first part of this talk. For those of you who haven't seen it, you can bookmark this, and after this talk is over, you can watch it and supplement this viewing with it. I just want to say one word about the symposium at the start and why this talk is, I think, a really special one, in that Ben Catcher founded this series kind of on ideals that sprung out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, egalitarian ideas around, especially, I think one of Ben's main priorities was the free university. And the talk that Bill gave last season and the one that he's going to give tonight is something that I think is very important to provide to audiences for free. The speakers in this series are given an honorarium, as they would if they were maybe speaking at Parsons. But the difference is with the symposium that this talk is open to all, not just people that are attending a university and paying a tuition. And the talk that Bill is going to give, I think, is something that I'm very grateful that there is a public, there is a chance for just the public in general to engage with the ideas and history that Bill is going to speak on. One thing I should say along those lines is that because this is because the audience for these talks is very much in mind with the idea of the symposium, I really encourage people in the audience, while Bill is talking, if you have a question or if you have something that you'd like to say or a comment or just something that you'd like Bill to expand upon, do not hesitate to write a question in the chat. And once Bill is done with his presentation, I will you can mention in your question if you'd like me to call on you, and you can read your question out loud and go on video if you like, or I can just, if you know that you'd rather I just read the question for you. I'm going to read a quick bio of Bill, but I just want to say Bill is someone who has spent a lot of time thinking and working with comics very much. He spends a lot of time working with comics in the present, and he looks at comics from the past. And I think in both modes, and looking at comics from the past and present, Bill is someone, a historian and critic and scholar, who doesn't accept received ideas about what the medium is and what it can do. He looks closely at comics and really comes up with ideas and narratives about what their true potential can be. And I think that's very evident in his last talk, and I'm very excited to hear this one. I'm just going to put a couple more links in here. This is a link that I'm going to put into the chat of the schedule for this season's symposium. There might be other talks that you're interested in, and I'm going to put a link to just our general YouTube channel where all talks from this season and past seasons have been archived. And this talk will be archived as well after either tonight or tomorrow. So I'm just going to read a quick bio of Bill, and then we will kick things over to him. Bill Kartalopoulos is an internationally recognized comics critic, educator, curator, and editor. He served as the series editor for the #1 New York Times bestselling Best American Comics series for 6 annual volumes beginning in 2014. He teaches courses about comics at the undergraduate and graduate levels at Parsons and at the School of Visual Arts. He has curated exhibits about comics across North America and in Greece, Switzerland, and France, and currently serves as the programming director for the MoCCA Arts Festival in New York. He is currently writing History of Comics, forthcoming from Princeton University Press. For more information, please visit on-panel.com. And so without further ado, here is Bill Kartalopoulos.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Austin. So yeah, as Austin said, this talk that I'm going to give today is kind of a follow-up to a talk I had given last fall as part of the symposium. I don't see a lot of people's faces, but I'm just I'm just kind of wondering, how many people who are here now saw that talk, either when we did it last fall or maybe since then on YouTube? Have several, or maybe nobody? I see a few kind of thumbs up and hands waving and heads nodding and stuff. Okay, well, I think probably a lot of people did, but nevertheless, I hope this will be intelligible, even if you haven't. I do have a couple slides just at the beginning that sort of recap a little bit what I talked about last time. So anyway, with that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen and get started here. Just give me a minute here. Okay, 1 sec. Organize my windows. And great. This is it. Okay. Austin, can you tell me if I'm sharing everything's the way it should be?
You are sharing your screen. I see the title page and a thumbnail of you speaking at the side.
Okay, that sounds like a classic Zoom situation to me. Okay, fantastic. So let me get into it then. So the talk that I gave last fall had the same title, Avant-Garde Histories of Comics, but covering the years 1945 to 1970. And the general, and I don't want to spend a lot of time recapping, but the general thesis was that, if we look at the histories of art, avant-garde, and cultural movements during that period, we can see a lot of production of material that seems to me very much like comics, or basically is comics, but coming at it for a lot of different reasons and with a lot of different concerns than people who might have been more self-consciously making comics at the same period of time. And part of the general focus of the last talk was that there were these two major influences on a lot of this work, which is a kind of visual turn towards, a sort of visual turn in poetry, as well as the influence of pop art. And certainly, even though I covered that period of 45 to 70, the majority of the work that I focused on was from the 60s, and certainly from the period beginning with the emergence of pop art in the late 50s, even if some of it had very strong roots in the immediate post-war years. So, in many different ways, you can sort of see this work emerging from a number of concerns that often involve either or both of those two influences, a kind of visual turn in poetry and the influence or response or reaction to pop art. And in a way, one way you can look at it is that there was something about pop art that permitted a kind of engagement with material that artists perhaps had resisted engaging previously, maybe even encouraged that engagement. But while a lot of mainline pop art tended to isolate imagery from comics and just kind of appropriate single images or refer to comics, what poetry brought to it was a kind of syntax and structure that kept the work very much in that legible, we might say it made the work legible as comics. The poetic concerns of poets who were involved with concrete poetry, or writers who are collaborating with artists, as we see throughout the work of Joe Brainerd and others. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I talked about. And among other things, at the end of the last talk, I noted that, if we think about comics in the 60s, certainly this work that I talked about last time creates a very different context for the eventual emergence of underground comics and other things. And also too, in some ways, it provides a sort of ancestral story maybe for some very contemporary avant-garde work, that maybe resembles this work from outside of the comics field more than it does historical comics, a kind of alternative history of alternative comics, to quote someone very intelligent. Anyway, so what I want to do today is continue looking forward and continue looking at things that we might pull from different contexts and perhaps assemble into a kind of alternative history of comics. And there are a number of things that I'm not doing. First of all, I'm not showing everything that I might think of that popped up during this 20-year period here. That would be a lot. I'm trying to, give the talk some focus, just as I did last time. But at the same time, one of the things that we see after the 60s getting into the 70s is a sort of divergence into a lot of different areas. And I think some of that is very much a consequence of pop art and, the beginning of, what we can call postmodern art, which is to say a sort of fragmentation of the mainline narrative of modernism, and work moving in a lot of different directions, including minimalism, conceptual art, performance, book arts, and a lot of other areas. And one of the other things we also see in the 70s and moving forward is a lot more diversity among artists too. We see more work by women, more work by people of color. So anyway, the narrative isn't quite as neat as maybe the previous one, where we're talking about comics between pop and poetry as these two kind of dominating factors. Nevertheless, I have kind of grouped everything into three very broad and overlapping categories. And in fact, many of these artists could fit into more than one, but it does at least, I think, provide us with a little structure. And one of the last things I talked about in the previous talk was Joe Brainerd's contributions to the East Village Other, which were simultaneous with a lot of early underground comics in that newspaper. And I'd like to start again with work that appeared in the mass media, particularly in New York alternative newspapers. And this is the first category of work I'm considering, which is a concept of performance on paper. As I said, performance is a big part of what comes to the fore in the 60s and 70s. And there's something about performance that is, obviously it's not at all like comics in that it's ephemeral, it's live, it's bodies, moving around, it's the audience having, kind of spatial relationship. But at the same time, a lot of performance, at the very least, is documented. And when you take performance, which has certainly a time component to it, and kind of document it, we'll see several examples, I think, of how that can lead to comics. So what I want to start with is a series of pieces that kind of quietly started appearing in the Village Voice in 1973, September 1973. This is a page from the September 27th issue of The Voice. And this is mostly advertising that we see here. And if you zoom in really closely, you see that there's a little face there with a thought balloon in among the advertising. Here it's performance arts advertising. And we see that there's a little figure there with large Afro-style hairstyle, sunglasses, what looks like a mustache, and the thought balloon. And the language reads, today was the first day of school. The only decent boys in my class are Robbie and Clyde. I think I like Clyde. And that's dated September 21st, 1961. Okay, well, that's weird. But what we see then is that every month afterwards, usually in the on the page advertising gallery shows, once a month in the weekly Village Voice, this figure continues to appear. And here we see it again. There threw a set for the home crowd this evening. It was a real gas. It's nice to be appreciated for a big house. Quite a change from New Lincolnites, I'll say that. And this is October 27th, 1962. You know, and we see ads for Chuck Close and other things that are happening at that same moment in 1973. And this continues page after page in the Village Voice. Once a month in the gallery advertisements, someone has purchased advertising space and inserted this type of panel with the same repeated figure but different text. Here we see, by the way, also an ad for Edward Gorey at the Gotham Bookmark Gallery. But anyway, so month after month in the gallery section, we see this figure. Okay, so what is going on here? What is the deal with this? Here's a closer image here. We've got this repeated image of this figure, seems to be the same image over and over again with a thought balloon and different text that seems to be of a personal nature. And this figure looks like, you know, a mustached man with large hair, but in fact, this is an artist named Adrian Piper. Adrian Piper was born in 1948. She is, you know, and this is relevant to the work, you know, she has, you know, described herself as a you know, a light-skinned Black woman who can pass for white. And she started out very much, you know, probably like a lot of young artists at the time, interested in conceptual art and performance. You know, she started out making this you know, conceptual art influenced by the ideas of Sol LeWitt, who we'll return to later. But principally, she engaged in confrontational acts of public performance. And she was trying to avoid initially the gallery system and wanting to have a kind of direct contact with the public. So she was doing various kinds of street performance, like this you know, performance that we see a photo from her Catalysis series, which included another performance in which she like doused her clothes in like rotten eggs and vinegar for a week and then like rode the subway for an hour. And so a lot of it was about you know, catalyzing other people's reactions to her. At the same time that she's developing her art practice, Adrian Piper is someone who also is pursuing an interest in philosophy. In fact, she shortly afterwards went to Harvard and got a PhD in philosophy. You know, as she was developing her practice, one of the things that she wanted to do was maintain this practice of kind of stimulating these reactions from an audience, but at the same time, she wanted to depersonalize it so that it was less about her own personal biography. So she created this character. She started dressing up as a man, essentially in drag, you know, wearing these mirrored shades and this mustache and smoking like a cigar and the wig and so forth. And she called this character who she created the mythic being, this being who doesn't exist, but who she would perform as. And this photo here is basically the mythic being photo that, you know, appeared in like every one of these installments of the Village Voice. So again, she's kind of avoiding the gallery system. She's trying to have direct public contact with the public. So she's working in a printed mass medium, you know, and in a way she's kind of engaging in an act of commerce to do so, buying these advertising inches in the Voice. There was only one that was rejected where it says, don't feel particularly horny, but feel I should masturbate anyway, just because I feel so good about doing it. And I should note all of this text is actually taken from her diaries, from old diaries, which in a way would seem like it goes against wanting to make the piece about her own identity. But what she would do in performances is use this text as a mantra and just say it over and over again to the point where it lost any meaning. So she would like kind of meditate on this line for a whole month, so it didn't even feel like it belonged to her anymore. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to just show you like a minute or so of a video clip in which we see her doing this. So just give me 1 minute.
Very much out of what I had been doing in systems, internal expectations versus external audience perceptions. The idea is very much to see what would happen if there was a being who had exactly my history, only a completely different visual appearance to the rest of society. And that's why best for men. And I find that when I put on the garb, it somehow transforms the nature of the experiences that I'm thinking about. No matter how much my best friends were stop buying crackers, cookies, and things she does anyway and says it's for her, no matter how much I ask my mother to stop buying crackers, cookies, and things she does anyway and says it's for her, even if I always eat it, so I've decided to fast. No matter how much I ask my mother to stop buying crackers, cookies, and things she does anyway, because it's for her, even if I always eat it. So I decided to fast. No matter how much I ask my mother to stop buying crackers, cookies, and things she does anyway and says it's for her, even if I always eat it. So I decided to fast. No matter how much I ask my mother I decided no matter how much I ask them to stop buying practice, no matter how much I ask my mother to stop buying crackers,
Okay. Anyway, you can see the entire clip on YouTube. It's only about a minute longer, but I think you get the idea. So okay, we've already we've started to engage some comics imagery. We've got text image, we've got performance, but what we really start to see is sequence coming more into the work. So for example, this is a piece where she's altering photographs, and she begins with a photograph of herself with a friend who betrayed her, and shows herself transforming into this mythic being as she's recounting this incident of her, her friend sneaking around behind her back and going out with some guy she was dating. But then she begins to kind of document these performances with photography. At the same time, too, she begins to make them less about her own personal experience and more directly about race, this is part of her dealing with her own identity as a person of color who can pass for white, where she suddenly is noticing that she is more kind of marked as a person of color or noticeable as a person of color in this outfit, and people react to her differently. So she begins doing documented performances like cruising white women, where she's kind of engaging in stereotypical activities. And on top of that, and as well as documenting these performances, she begins producing visual pieces that she publishes as posters, where she takes a photograph and then draws on top of it with oil pastel. So again, we're getting these kind of interesting, even more so, I think, than the collaged images that we saw before, these kind of interesting cartoon panels. And again, this mythic being is acquiring a very different kind of personality and identity as being kind of like an avatar of a fear of the other. So here what mythic being is saying, I embody everything you most hate and fear. This is another photo sequence she produced, where you can see a little bit of her, philosophical studies coming into it. I am the locus of consciousness, surrounded and constrained by animate physical objects with moist, fleshy, pulsating surfaces. Get out of my way, asshole. And so there's always this kind of twist, sending up, you might say, audience expectations of the mythic figure, or giving the figure this kind of swaggering attitude here. This is another sequence called Let's Have a Talk. And again, we see the mythic figure, in the dark, smoking, the light comes in, let's have a talk to bring us closer, as close friends do. Come nearer, may I stroke your back? Okay, so this kind of solicitous, almost sexual kind of come on here. Again, the attitude of the mythic being, it doesn't matter who you are, if what you want to do to me is what I want you to do for me. Interesting material here, using beginning with this idea of like a performance on paper, documenting a performance, and then essentially creating, a kind of interesting photo comic that we see here. She's gone on to do a lot of other kinds of work. The mythic being material, all I think dates from 73 to 75 or 74 to 75. And this is a later piece, self-portrait as a nice white lady, where she brings back some of the techniques of the mythic being. She's also, she was a tenured professor of philosophy. She lives in Germany now. This is a more recent piece, which has a kind of interesting element of sequence there as well. Anyway, I think it's an interesting body of work, and certainly, a lot of these pieces, particularly these ones that have the oil pastel on top of the photography, I have no problem reading as a kind of comics, but it's just different than what we normally expect comics to look like, but it's being put to really fascinating purpose. If we're talking about this idea of photography and performance leading to a kind of avant-garde photo comic, another artist who comes immediately to mind, who probably several of you are familiar with, is the photographer Dwayne Michaels, who has a huge body of work and had a really nice exhibition at the Morgan Library right before the lockdown. This is Michaels, still alive, still working, born in 1932. He only started photographing when he was 26. That's still very young, but up until that point, he didn't have any inclination towards a photography practice when he started. One of his early, and I should say he worked both as a commercial photographer and he did personal work as well. One of his early series was a series called Empty New York, where he photographed empty spaces in the city. He would often get up very early on Sunday mornings and just walk around the city. He got very good at shooting through windows in such a way where it didn't look like he was shooting through a window. So it's interesting to see these photos of New York, first of all, just in general, New York 1963, but also this kind of image of a depopulated New York City. But as he was making these photos, he had a thought that these empty spaces were suddenly looking to him like sets that were waiting for performers to come in and perform. This led to him producing what ended up being like a 50-year body of photo sequences. This is one of the very early ones. The girl becomes frightened by a door. And we see here, these are not actualities. He's not, this is not street photography. This is not captured in the moment. He's getting models and posing them and staging situations. So this becomes, in a way, a kind of photograph performance too. He's just got these originally, initially these kind of, just these slight moments, where we see some, this woman sitting and reading, and then suddenly the door starts to take on a kind of life of its own. And, there's a big question as to, what might be behind the door causing it to open there. So it's just this very kind of slight moment captured as a photo sequence. But he produced, even very early on, an interesting variety of work. One of his early photo pieces is called Paradise Regained. And it begins, as we see here, with a couple sitting in an apartment. And you can see that he's really transformed the environment from image to image. He's got the models progressively disrobing, so it goes from being a kind of modern apartment to an image of a Edenic apartment with, these nude figures and plants everywhere. Another one of his early pieces is called Chance Meeting, and it's just this image of two men, dressed up in business clothes, walking down a kind of street or alley, passing each other, and then one turns and glances over their shoulder, and then the other one does as well. And these can be interpreted many ways, but certainly one of them is as a reference to Michael's own queer identity, which is something that becomes more prominent as his work progresses. Certainly a lot of images of, kind of idealized male beauty in some of these sequences. This is a later photo sequence called Narcissus, based on the ancient Greek myth, and we see, this being performed photographically. I want to show you one of his early sequences, though, that show his more fanciful side even more directly, and also is a reference to his identity. This sequence is called Things Are Queer, which is a reference as well to Alice in Wonderland. And we begin with this image of what appears to be a bathroom, and then suddenly we have this change of scale, again, the Alice in Wonderland reference, and then suddenly that's reframed again, and then another reframing, and we see that someone's looking at this image in a book, and then we see the person reading the book, reframed again. We see this person walking down a kind of alley or arcade, and then finally that becomes a photo itself, and we realize at the end that that was the photo hanging over the sink in the bathroom in the initial image. So we have this kind of circular narrative in Things Are Queer, which is interesting. It's an interesting type of visual narrative. And this work was first published in some photography magazines in the late 60s, including Camera, which I think was a Swiss photography magazine. And based on the appearance of these early sequences in photography magazines, he was offered a book deal by Doubleday. So in 1970, a book called Sequences was published that collected many of his early photo sequences. And as a result of his work appearing in the magazines and the book, he got a show at the Museum of Modern Art. So there was a small show of Dwayne Michaels' photo sequences at MoMA. And this is so interesting to me because it really just begins to gesture at something that I think we'll see more examples of, which is this idea of, something like a comic that's made for installation, you might say. I mean, it's really looking at something like this on the wall is very much like reading a comic in space, like going to a gallery, going from image to image to image and reading a comic. This is another image of the installation Stories by Dwayne Michaels at MoMA. So to me, just a kind of treat to see like something like a little comic strip running along the walls of the Museum of Modern Art. And I want to clarify too that what Dwayne Michaels was doing at the time was very iconoclastic, very unorthodox relative to what was considered typical within the still emerging field of art photography. The basic model really was still a kind of journalistic photography. A documentary kind of photo was really considered the height of the art of photography, you might say. And he talked in one interview about how his work was considered out of step. So he mentions this curator at MoMA who wasn't interested in what he was doing. I was anathema to him. He was strictly reportage. If he included me in anything, it was because he had to. I was too visible to ignore, okay? And there was a gallery assistant who was also sympathetic to Dwayne Michaels' work, which helps as well. Nevertheless, what we see is someone starting to develop a body of photo comics and beginning too in the 70s to add text to the sequences. This is one called Take One and See Mount Fujiyama. This is another one called The Pleasures of the Glove from 1974. I have a few close-up images of this one. You know, so it begins with this figure, you know, although it meant walking blocks out of his way, it had become a daily ritual with him to look in the window. He was strangely pleased to see they were still there. Of course, it had occurred to him to buy the gloves, but to own them would have ruined it, would it not? It would not be the same. And we see him, of course, he's bought the gloves. The gloves had become a queer tunnel. He wondered where the tunnel led. The glove ate his hand, and then it continues from there, and then the glove starts to be this thing that gives sort of, you know, that begins acting on his hidden impulses. So, you know, and another thing I'll note about Michaels too is that even though the work is exhibited and has been exhibited, you know, he tends to think that actually the ideal form of viewing his work is in the context of a book. So, you know, he does think of this as work that, you know, I mean, yes, he makes prints of them, but made in a way for publication. So again, you know, it's interesting to look at this work and think about the possibilities of photo comics in terms of influences. You know, I think this one might be influenced by a series of etchings that Max Klinger produced in 1881 called The Glove. Obviously, there is also a history of photo comics. You know, some of them sort of, you know, in the kind of like trashy giallo sort of genre, you know, others more experimental. And this is one that we looked at in the last talk. You know, Michaels is aware of comics, but doesn't really talk about them as a big influence. You know, he has talked about growing up Catholic and the Stations of the Cross. I did go to his gallery opening, and I talked to him separately another time when I asked him about comics. He said he wasn't especially influenced by comics, except that, as he said, Prince Valiant made him gay. So that's, you know, something to think about. But as I said, in addition to making art photography, Michaels is also a commercial photographer. It's possible you've seen his work. He did fair amount of celebrity portraiture. He did the photography on the cover of this Police album, Synchronicity, if you've seen that. And, you know, among his other works, he's a huge fan of Magritte. I think you can get that from the kind of, you know, whimsical surrealism of some of his work. And he went and met Magritte and photographed him. And there's a book of that. I would say up until this moment, probably the best collection of his sequences or photo comics is a 1976 book called Real Dreams that has more work in it than the Doubleday Sequences book, and was published later, and is, I think, better reproduction. It's out of print, but the good news is that there's a collection of his sequences that's supposed to come out next year. So it's coming from a German art publisher. So anyway, that's another interesting artist here. And again, you know, even though Dwayne Michaels and Adrian Piper are coming from very different places, they're both in a way bringing both you know, combining performance. Certainly, you know, Dwayne Michaels, you know, stages performances, you know, by these models who he hires to perform as, you know, essentially actors in his sequences. Combining performance with photography, you get, you know, sequence, and you basically get photo comics. I want to talk about another artist whose work also has something to do with performance, but not, not so much with photography, and that's Ida Appelbrug. And Ida Appelbrug is someone who's worked across different media, and I guess she's primarily identified as a painter. She has a pretty interesting history. She didn't really start showing art until she was like in her 40s. She kind of had another career before that as a sort of graphic designer and commercial artist. She raised 4 kids, but she had a kind of crisis in her early 40s. She checked herself into a mental institution, and she started producing a very different kind of work there, these Mercy Hospital drawings from 1969 to 1970. Don't look much like anything that she would produced later, but was the beginning of a very different kind of art production for her. And one of the, I think the earliest body of work that's connected to her whole body of work probably is the Galileo Works series from 1976. And you can see there's something interesting already going on here. There's this imagery that's sort of repetitious, but not exactly, has an element of sequence. And we're also seeing this kind of text and image interaction here. This is a more kind of typical format of this work. So she's working with ink on vellum. She's making these drawings, and then they have a kind of 3-dimensional quality too. There was always this window that we're looking at the images through. That's like peeking through a window at a private moment. It has a kind of proscenium-like quality too, as if you're looking at actors on a stage. And the work has this kind of interesting materiality. It's casting a shadow. It's sort of semi-transparent. And what's really interesting about this is the use of repetition. So that when we look more closely at this image, it's like we're peeking through a window here, and we're looking at this shocking moment that would typically be something that happens behind closed doors outside of view of a man beating a woman in what looks like an instance of intimate partner violence. And we see this image, and then we see it again, and then we see it again, and we see it again, and then there's this caption that appears floating in the air, this ironic caption that says, "The sweet smell of sage enters the room." Then we see the image repeated again without the caption, and then finally one more time before we get to the conclusion of the piece. And and this is the beginning of a lot of imagery by her that we'll see that uses these techniques of repetition and variation at the same time. And what the introduction of that text element does is it really makes this a sequential piece. It's not just the same image 6 times in a row. Rather, it becomes clear that the repetition of the image is meant to fix the viewer's attention on a particular image in a sustained way. And then you get this kind of ironic, sort of pseudo-romantic kind of text about the sweet smell of sage entering the room, and then you return to that image. So you get this kind of ironic counterpoint that then kind of leaves the image feeling somehow even more jaundiced, like a betrayal of the potential of a relationship here in the worst possible way. So she was producing these works. She wasn't but she was not really connected to, the art world. I mean, she'd started producing this work fairly late in life. And the first thing she did with it was she started making a series of artists' books. Between 78 and 82, she produced 2 sets of artists' books, ranging from, I think, 7 to 10 books per series. They're all the same size, about 8 by 10, a little smaller than that maybe. And these are offset printed in editions of, I think, 500 or something like that. And I'll show you one of the ones from the first stack. So these ones with the black cover here from 78 to 79 are Galileo works. That's what that series is called, as is, sorry, wrong slide, this body of work overall. So it's based on these images, these, kind of transparent windows juxtaposed with one another and with text. So I'm Not Your Son is essentially almost like a performance on paper, and all of these artists' books that she publishes are called, or subtitled rather, a performance. So we can go through one of these and we'll see there's a lot of repetition that's very intentional, including the insertion of blank pages and so on. So these are pictures that I took from an archive, so they're not fantastic, but I think they render the book at least visible. So anyway, we go through this book here, see a blank spread, another pause, like this kind of silent overture that continues for another 2 pages. And then finally, we see the 2 characters, these 2 kind of what look like 2 decapitated men, one confronting the other. And we see that image of the confrontation repeated 2 more times, repeated twice more. And then the text, I'm not your son, sort of characterizing this confrontation that we return to. And then we return to it again with this, this kind of text lingering in the air and sort of coloring our sense of the relationship between the 2 people and the sort of heat of that moment. And then we reach the end of the book. So that's the end of that particular performance in the series called Galileo Works. So we see over a period of a few years, she would make these little books, and kind of like Adrian Piper, she with her monthly panel in the Village Voice, she was also working on a schedule. She would send these little booklets out every month during the period of time she was producing them. These are a couple of examples from the Blue Book series, which was the last series. Again, apologies for the cell phone shadow. I did the best I could with the lighting conditions available. But anyway, so this is called Stop Crying, a performance. So again, we open the book and we see a woman sitting by herself. The image is repeated 2 more times. Repeated 2 more times. Then we see Stop Crying. The return of the image. The doctor goes first. This image twice. 2 blank pages. And then a change in the image where we see this couple in bed. Presumably the woman who's leaning over is the same person we saw before, saying, I can still smell it. And then we return to blank pages, and then the book ends. And that, I mean, these are open-ended narratives, obviously, but the combination of text and image, particularly with the repetition, really creates a space for the text to resonate and build associations based on the images that we're seeing in front of us. I can show you 1 or 2 more. Some of these are quite heavy. I mean, certainly Stop Crying seems to suggest, maybe a medical procedure, perhaps an unwanted medical procedure, someone who's haunted by it afterwards. This one starts out in a similar, with kind of a similar heaviness, but then takes, you never know when they're going to take a turn. So this one's called I Can't. We open the book to a blank page, and we see 2 women, one comforting the other. We stay in this moment for 2 more images. We see I Can't. We return to the figures together. Please. We return to this image. I can't. You see them again. Let's all kiss mommy goodbye. And then the blanks and the back cover rather. So suddenly you kind of get this like cliched moment out of like a cop show or something, interrupting what seems like this very quiet moment. Anyway, there are quite a few of these. I think, there's something like 27 of these books total, and I find them to be very interesting. Again, as obviously, they're categorized as artist books, but I have no problem again reading them as comics. No more difficult than say Franz Mazariel. Although obviously she's doing something very different with the form, and she talked about making these books about how she had no idea how to get a gallery, so she made a mailing list of 500 writers and artists she knew and liked, and would just ship them out at the Canal Street post office. And she said there are a lot of people who have them still, and there were people who wrote back and said, "Who are you? Don't ever send me anything like that again." I kept all the responses. I thought the books were reasonable myself. I thought they were kind of funny too. In fact, I even had a little fantasy and sent some out to the New Yorker. I thought they would make nice New Yorker cartoons. I got a very polite response saying, "Thank you, but no thank you." So I thought that was kind of funny. I saw her give a talk. Somebody mentioned in the chat, her daughter is the experimental filmmaker Beth B. And Beth B made a documentary film about Ida Applebrug called Call Her Applebrug. And I did see a screening of that at MoMA where both of them were in attendance. And I'm having a very hard time finding this quote, but I think it was at that performance, and maybe that's why I can't find it, but someone asked her a question about graphic novels, and she said something like, "I guess I was making graphic novels and I didn't even know it," so that was a kind of nice little confirmation there. I just want to mention, just show a couple of other examples of her work here. She works with this kind of window like frame with the shade half drawn, this sort of proscenium that we see here. And in fact, she did a window installation for Printed Matter in 1980 with this kind of imagery that was even reviewed in Art Forum in March 1980. Just seeing those images and those large windows on the street reminded me a little bit of the Rosta windows, the so-called Rosta windows produced by Vladimir Mayakovsky and other Soviet artists shortly after the Soviet Revolution, which were just these kind of large comic strip-like sequences that were meant to, essentially propaganda. Anyway, and we see, moving on to other media, we see these elements of sequence, text, image, repetition showing up in a lot of Applebrug's work for many years. This is another one. Obviously, this is a painting, and we have another sequence with this man and woman, and the caption of the first image says, "You're rat food," and then we see that image repeated twice, and then the man leans in and says, "I'm a pharmacist." Okay, or this one here. We see a woman who, appears to be pregnant, and then we see the text, "I'm back on the pill." We have another pause, and the figure saying, "Here, I'm not deaf." This man with a dog. And we see these elements recurring in larger canvases and other work in other media. The last image I wanted to show of her work just very quickly that I thought just was interesting to see in this context. She was invited in, I think it was 1980, to do an installation at the Great Hall of the 1982, at the New York Chamber of Commerce, the organization Creative Time, the arts organization that commissions public projects, commissioned her to do something. And in the Great Hall, you've got this kind of monument to commerce decorated with all of these oil paintings of men who have been the presidents of the Chamber of Commerce, this, temple of capitalism. So she installed this small statue of this woman with flowers and put it on the podium, the speaker's podium in the Chamber of Commerce, with this attached word balloon saying, "Gentlemen, America is in trouble." So it's almost like I mean, this to me kind of looks almost like a situationist kind of intervention, you know, like the images that I showed in the last talk, you know, and this was considered a little offensive to the Chamber of Commerce, and for much of the shows, for much of the period of time when she was, this installation was supposed to be up, it was regularly removed from the Chamber of Commerce, and there's some stuff that you can read about that. So in different ways, you know, Ida Applebrug, Dwayne Michaels, Adrian Piper, these are three very, very different artists who are making very different kinds of work. You know, they're all, I think one thing they share is they're all iconoclastic. They don't really fit neatly into categories. I mean, certainly Adrian Piper's work, you know, you might say fits into conceptual art or performance. You know, Dwayne Michaels is a photographer, but doing work that's very much outside of, you know, what one normally sees in art photography. You know, and Ida Applebrug is someone who, you know, again, she's probably generally classified as a painter, but she's really working across media in ways that are quite interesting. And again, I think what they all have in common is this idea, you know, from my perspective as someone who's coming at it with a comics background, of you know, sort of essentially arriving at a kind of interesting type of comic by bringing elements of performance to print, essentially, whether that's you know, Dwayne Michaels, Adrian Piper, or Ida Applebrug. I want to move on to the next category of work, which has to do, you know, very broadly, I think, with image as text, and thinking both of image as text and in some cases text as image. And I think this brings some interesting things to the fore. I'm going to start out picking up in a way with the legacy of pop art, which I talked about a lot in the last presentation, and in particular, the kind of maybe next wave of pop artists or post-pop artists who, you know, in some ways were seen as Andy Warhol's successors, Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. I'm not going to spend so much time on Basquiat. I think he's, you know, I like his work. Certainly, you know, he and Haring have a lot in common. They were both involved with street art, and they both, you know, in very different ways, you can say, reference cartooning in their work. Basquiat certainly combines text and image. We see a lot of comic book and comic strip references here. You know, here Robin has Dick Tracy's two-way wrist radio, you know, or, you know, this kind of politically inflected piece that, you know, kind of juxtaposes this reference to, you know, the founding fathers as slave traders with Captain America. Nevertheless, you know, even though the aesthetics of this are quite different than, say, the pop art of Roy Lichtenstein, essentially this engages with comics in a similar way. You know, we're seeing imagery, iconography from comics. We're seeing text image in combination, but we're not really seeing something that's readable as comics in and of itself. The only exception I'm aware of in his body of work is actually an unfinished 8-page comic he produced in 1978 that looks very, very different from the rest of his work. And I think, you know, I haven't looked at it very closely. I've seen these types of images that, you know, I mean, suggest his interest in comics, but don't, you know, I'd say this is something that feels very separate from the body of work that he's actually known for. But I think Keith Haring, even though that he has so many similarities to Basquiat, is a very different case. I think probably we're all very aware of Keith Haring. His work continues to be very visible. You know, certainly among his ambitions was to make art for everyday people, make his art available widely, to make art part of everyday life. You know, he opened a store called the Pop Shop where he basically merchandised his own artwork. And, you know, that continues. Certainly, you know, we see Keith Haring at Uniqlo and other brand collabs happening quite often these days. And, you know, he was someone who really started making art very publicly, even as a student at SVA. But his early work, even before he entered SVA, and then his early student work, is somewhat different than the work for which he became well known. He was influenced by many different artists. Here we see Kandinsky and Mondrian, Pierre Alashinsky, who I talked about in the last presentation, was also an influence. So, you've got something like these cartoon outlines, but more abstract. This is an early painting that really resembles some of the lettrist work that I talked about in the last presentation. But like a lot of artists, and again, you can think of the Adrian Piper work that we were looking at before, like a lot of artists at that time, he got involved with, other forms like conceptual art, performance, text art in particular. He was doing a lot of things with collage at one point, and things like word art of various kinds, mimeographed typographical pieces, and so on. Very different from what we associate with Haring. At a certain point, he was even wondering if he was going to continue withdrawing. But while he was at SVA, he was strongly influenced by some coursework he did about semiotics. And he started thinking a lot about semiotics and started thinking about the image as a word. The image as text, essentially, and this is from his notes when he was a student. His journals have been published. Paintings can be read as poems if they are read as words instead of images that represent words. Egyptian art, hieroglyphics, pictograms, symbolism. And this is what informed his work when he returned to drawing. And he started developing just in a series of drawings that he produced spontaneously or I should say at least one leading to the other spontaneously, for his first drawing show after he started college at Club 57. And he just started developing this iconography, and he was essentially using sequence, comic style narrative to generate imagery. And in fact, he generated the entire visual vocabulary of his career, essentially, drawing kind of improvised comics featuring a small number of symbols. So he talked about, he started drawing these new drawings of flying saucers that were zapping animal figures that would, zap them with this energy wave, and then rays would come out of them. And he says they were very rough and quick. There would be a picture of someone fucking the animal from the back, the same animal that had these growing rays of power. And after the person fucked the animal, the dick had the glowing power on it. There was a picture of a glory hole with their dick through the hole, and they're back to the crowd, but their dick was being worshipped by the crowd, which could only see this glowing rod, and so forth. And out of these was born the entire vocabulary that came afterwards. Hope I don't get banned by YouTube. So anyway, but these aren't exactly necessarily the first images he drew, but these are the types of images he was producing, these kind of rough and ready drawings that, were based on this system, these kind of flying saucers, kind of shooting rays at people, and then these rays getting communicated. And then suddenly that generates imagery. It generates images of power relationships, which are very important in Haring's early work. And this generated the imagery, as I said before, that he became very well known for, including the image of the person crawling on all fours with these radiating lines that came to be called his radiant baby. And at the same time that he's producing these visual narratives and generating these images, Haring, is, I think is well known, had, an interest in street art. He was also very clear that he himself was not a street artist, because he knew that what he was doing as an art student and person, trying to establish himself in the art world was different than, someone, like in, the Bronx writing graffiti, who had a very different kind of experience than he had. But he was, and also, as I think is very well known, he started drawing in chalk on these black panels that were in subway stations where ads were supposed to be installed. And, he talks about how he finally felt comfortable writing graffiti because he had these images that he came up with that essentially functioned as his name. So, you know, this image of the radiant baby, or the glowing dog, or the barking dog, you know, these stood in for his name. And it's worth noting that even though graffiti, you know, is a kind of drawing, we also talk about graffiti as graffiti writing, right? People who do graffiti are called graffiti writers, you know, and the first thing that one does is a tag, and the tag is the name, even if it's not, you know, your legal name, you know, like Taki 182 or whatever, you know, that's the thing that one writes as a graffiti writer. Anyway, so this all kind of comes out of a sort of equation of the image and text. And then the idea that these images can be recombined to produce new images. So he showed, you know, so he starts showing work that comes out of this initial, you know, kind of flood of drawings, you know, and up at the very top of this flyer that has a photo of a show at PS 122, you know, we can see sort of like a large horizontal sequence right at the top, you know, similar to what we were talking about before, you know, the flying saucer zapping the person, and then the person getting oral sex and so on, you know, and he really fleshed out these images for a very important series of drawings that he exhibited at Westbeth Painters Space in 1981, February 1981. I don't know if you can see, but in the kind of crouching leg of the crawling figure here, the not radiant baby, we see the text "Black Blueprints, the untold story revealed." So there's this sense of narrative. And what he did was he created these very large drawings that came to be called the blueprint drawings. It's a series of, I think, 11 large images that really refine the imagery and sequence of events that he had initially started producing. And again, you know, in different ways, on a page-by-page basis, these become very much like comics with sort of elusive narratives. You know, which is something that I think we can say about a lot of the work that we're looking at today. It's narrative, but also narrative in an open way that allows space for interpretation. And that was certainly very much on Herring's mind. You know, he also wrote about how, you know, the work wasn't really complete until it was seen by a person who would then interpret it. I mean, that's also part of semiotic theory. You know, semiosis happens in the mind of the reader. So we see, you know, again, these images over and over again, you know, the figures, the flying saucers, the people holding the stick with power, the dogs, and so on. But again, you know, on a page-by-page basis, each of these is a kind of interesting sort of abstract comics narrative. And he called these blueprints because initially he had them printed on blueprint paper. This is an image, not blue ink, red ink in this case. But again, I mean, this is precisely illustrating the narrative that I read earlier with the, you know, flying saucer zapping the dog and the person, you know, engaging in bestiality and so on and so forth. You know, and this is an image of Herring at the Westbeth Painters Space, you know, posing with these very, very large blueprint drawings that he had drawn, or in other words, these large comics pages that he had drawn. So he's using sequence to generate imagery. And I want to show one other piece. He produced a publication that also presented a very refined collection of these symbols, again, in narrative sequence. This was published in 1981. It's untitled. It's published by a press called Appearances Press, about which I really don't know anything that's associated with Appearances Magazine, which I also have never seen. But anyway, well, I've seen at least one other booklet in this series. But anyway, this is basically a comic. This is the first edition was published at 8.5 by 11 size. There was a second edition published at half letter size the following year in 1982. But again, you know, we're seeing those same narratives reworked again on the right. There's the there's that founding myth of the flying saucer, the man and the dog, again, you know, and other, again, other small narratives taking these symbols and using narrative as a way to recombine them and produce new images. And this is, you know, I mean, this is the way, you know, some artists I know who make comics talk about making comics, the idea that, you know, having the narrative and having sequence, among other things, becomes a way of generating images that one wouldn't have developed otherwise. And I think certainly for Herring, you know, who was thinking about these things semiotically, thinking about the word as image, then suddenly you get this kind of linguistic structure. And, you know, linguistic structure essentially leads to sequence. I will note that this was, you know, is considered an important body of work in Herring's career. A year before he died, he had these blueprint drawings produced as a portfolio of silk screens. And those have also been exhibited. This is just, I forgot to note the name of the gallery, but this is an image from a gallery that showed the blueprint drawings as a large uninterrupted kind of scroll here wrapping around the gallery. So again, you know, I think a lot of times when, you know, the idea of comics and art comes up, I think people who maybe don't have a background in comics might immediately think of someone like Herring, but they think of Herring just because the imagery has this obvious debt to cartoon drawing, you know, and certainly Herring talked about that, you know, growing up watching animated cartoons and reading comic strips. I mean, that's just the culture he came out of. You know, I think, you know, what makes Herring's work actually interesting in this context are these other bodies of work, specifically the blueprint drawings and this untitled zine, which, you know, again, they're interesting in and of themselves. You know, they're you know, pleasurable to look at. But again, I think they also speak to the way in comics, visual symbols, you know, through the engine of narrative can combine and recombine to produce new images. And that's a way of thinking about comics that Herring is an artist who's thinking about comics in a way, images rather, in a way that's informed by semiotic theory, arrived at quite naturally. I want to briefly talk about another artist who's kind of in this word image, text image group, and that's a British artist named Tom Phillips, who I guess is a book artist or maybe a conceptual, I guess he's probably more broadly a conceptual artist, which is a pretty handy catch-all for a lot of things. Tom Phillips started working on a project that he then ended up working on and off for about 50 years. In 1966. He had gone into an antique store with another artist and said, the first, you know, and this is where the kind of conceptual artist thinking comes in. He said something like, the first book that I find that costs 3 pence, I will work on will be my next project, and I will work on it for the next 50 years. Okay, so he kind of randomly found this Victorian novel called A Human Document. And what he did was, over a period initially of, I think, 4 years or maybe more, he painted over every single page in the book, retaining some of the text to create a new text. And he used these, what he called rivers, these spaces in between words and letters to connect the text. So suddenly this first page becomes the first page of a human document becomes the first page of a new book called, as he pronounces it, a humument. Suddenly the text reads, the following sing I, a book of art, of mind art, and that which he hid reveal I. And, you know, he had a number of constraints. So in some ways, you know, this was seen as a kind of, William Burroughs cut up kind of project, taking a pre-existing text and making a new text out of it. But it's also quite visual. And one of the things that I think we see as we go through a humulent, which he first completed, in 1973, but then over the course of many years, he reworked so that by, I think it was 2015, 50 years later, there was a totally new version of it. So it's been published in multiple editions. But what we see is how visual some of these pages become, and also how a kind of comics sequencing becomes a useful, maybe even necessary way of structuring some of these pages so that they remain clearly legible to the reader. So that essentially comic sequencing, and certainly there are a lot of visual elements as we see at the top of this page here that are, explicitly pictorial, but even when there aren't, comic sequencing becomes an important way of ordering this kind of fragmentary and disordered text. So this, in some respects, begins to look, in some cases like a kind of abstract comic, but in others, one that seems to be quite figurative here. I mean, this certainly looks like a comics page. Most of the images I'm showing are from the original 1973 edition, but there are a few from later versions. And what we see too is someone who's approaching this comes to a kind of sequencing, a kind of division of space that recalls comics as a way of structuring the reader's attention. And I think that's what a lot of this work does, where the sequence of images isn't necessarily inherently narrative in and of itself, but what I think work like this reveals is that actually the first fundamental act of a comics page, before you get into considerations of time or space or narrative, but the first fundamental act of any comics page is to structure the reader's attention. And I think that's what these pages do. They structure the reader's attention. And we see that, so for example, you can have suddenly these arrangements of text that deviate from the typical, left to right, top to bottom typographical format of the novel, because we have these other structuring devices that are basically functioning like panels. So I think that's interesting. Again, too, I think just some of these pages are quite beautiful, and again, it's hard not to read some of them very directly as comics. Certainly this one here, which has a kind of vertical column to the left and then a vertical column to the right, something, that experienced comics readers are accustomed to. Or this, again, it looks very different, from what we normally think of comics as looking like. But nevertheless, I mean, there's a very standard kind of arrangement here of a large panel with two panels below it. But also, too, one of the things that, and I'm sure I'll return to this point, that makes this kind of work very much worth studying is that you see people from outside of comics arriving at a point of using sequence for very different reasons, and developing, maybe structures that one wouldn't have thought of on their own. So we see different approaches to the form, or at least implications of different approaches to the form in work like this. And again, this is another one that looks very much like a juxtaposition of two images, one that's even, fairly comparatively figurative in the second image here. So I just wanted to run through some of those images. I don't want to make, too much out of this book in particular. I mean, there are many pages that, look less comics-like than the ones I'm looking at. Obviously, I'm cherry picking a bit here, but I think we can see something happening that has to do with the kind of visual arrangement of text, a kind of, again, maybe a less linear, but still quite planned syntactic structuring, which is, again, arguably what comics do with a space when they divide it up. I want to talk about one other work that I think also has really interesting you know, combinations of text and image. And that's a work called In the Crack of the Dawn. And In the Crack of the Dawn is a collaboration between two artists. One is Lawrence Weiner, who passed away last year. The other is Matt Mulliken, who's still living and working. And Lawrence Weiner's work, I would guess that some, if not many of you maybe are familiar with or have seen. I guess probably the best description of what he does is word art, although, you know, he's also considered a conceptual artist, that convenient phrase, because in part because his work is based on instructions that anyone can install as long as they follow the instructions precisely. But nevertheless, much of what he does is in the vein of this kind of installation-based word art, like we see here with these very characteristic typography that he started using at a certain point. This kind of curvature of text is also very characteristic of his work. You know, here this is an installation in a space in a German-speaking environment. So you've got the, you know, English language text in blue, the German language text in this kind of orange. Here, there's a lot of directional arrows that we see in his work as well. So what we see here is word as image in a way, you know, and he's also produced multiples, you know, like this is a kind of print, an editioned piece. This is on a plate of metal with these die cut pieces. He's produced, you know, artists' books, and other editioned objects. This was a cloth napkin he produced for printed matter. This was also at one point available as a tote bag that I regret not picking up when it was available. But anyway, for those of you who aren't familiar with Lawrence Weiner's work, this is just to give you a sense of his use of text as an image. So it's readable, but it also has a kind of visual presence, sometimes even a physical presence. You know, Matt Mulliken, also someone who's very broadly in that conceptual artist field. Some of his early works from the 70s were, you know, quite cartoon inflected, you might say. He produced a series of images of this character, Glenn. I think 500 images of this character, this kind of stick figure character, Glenn, who was an artist trapped in a studio, essentially, you know, and produced other images like this that, you know, characterize different postures. And he also did, you know, some collage-like work involving comics, and he separated, or excuse me, not separated rather, but kind of excerpted details from comics panels. You know, you can see in the comic strip in the sketchbook on the right-hand page, there's a kind of square drawn around the bottom of a piece of furniture. And that's an indicator of the kind of work he was doing. He would kind of separate out these fragments from comics pieces. It's a little like other work I've seen by like Ray Yoshida and others. But nevertheless, these were called, I think this series was called Fragments of a Fictional Reality. He also did some early computer art. And one of the things we see in the computer art is he's doing a couple of things that are characteristic across much of his work. He's creating this sense of a kind of architectural space that one can move through. And that architectural space is also heavily color coded, right? So we see, you know, buildings that are red and yellow and blue and so on. He's also produced architectural models along these lines. And a lot of what he does has to do with the visual representation of systems, different types of ideas represented visually, and also different orders of information, different registers of information. And in fact, the different colors he uses refer to 5 different registers of information. I forget exactly what they are, but like memory and visual information and haptic information and things like that. So, you know, when he's creating this kind of architectural space, it's also about a kind of interaction of a system of ideas and the way these different types of knowledge, in a way, epistemologically interact with each other. And so a lot of his works tend to be these sort of arrays of symbols that are, again, kind of like systems of information. So it's less like a sequence and really more like a diagram, and this does relate very closely to issues that come up when you're looking at work that comes out of the art world and thinking about it in terms of sequence, particularly serial art, conceptual art. And we'll look at some examples of this, where there's this kind of fine line between what we might call, say, an array or a matrix of images that are, not necessarily in a particular order, but it's more like a collection, like a, a frame with butterflies in it or something, versus, something that has a kind of syntactical reading order of the kind that text can provide. These images here that we see installed as an outdoor mural echo a series of prints that he called organizational legend, which is another good phrase for what I was just talking about, right? This kind of organization of images that each represent different groups, different orders of information, different types of icons. So again, this is the type of thing where it's like, it looks a little comics-like, but it's also really more just a kind of collection of different types of information. And here we see a lot of images of that architectural space that we've seen different versions of before. But these images of this color-coded architectural space became the basis for a collaboration between Lawrence Weiner and Matt Mulliken called, as I said before, In the Crack of the Dawn. And In the Crack of the Dawn is literally a comic book published by a gallery in Switzerland, the May 36 Gallery in Lucerne. I have a copy of this. It's pretty rare. I've taken pictures of the whole thing. So you can see it. I'm just going to flip through it pretty quickly. I don't know very much at all about the background of the book, other than pretty much what I've just told you, that it clearly derives from the system of imagery that Mulliken developed, while also being a collaboration with Mulliken and with Lawrence Weiner, and showing elements of Weiner's work in it as well. But I think what we're seeing here is something that we don't see in Mulliken's work much after that early work, which is this combination of text and image, and a kind of sequencing, that I think comes from working with text. And suddenly what we're being given here is, maybe something like a guided tour of Mulliken's cosmology that's inflected, that not only has a kind of syntactical structure, but is also inflected with language that presumably comes from Lawrence Weiner. And, we've got that same kind of color coding. All of this is imagery that we see in, the computer models or in the architectural drawings, but suddenly we're reading it in the form of a comic book. So we've got this poetic language combined with these images of this space that we're moving through, certainly some heavy abstraction, the color coding that comes from Mulliken's work, some very specific comics references here. I think that lower left-hand panel looks very much like it's referenced from a comic book, probably that fragment on the right as well. So we see elements of the kind of collage-like fragmentation of the other work, but also, really this kind of, this spread here is really fascinating. It just looks like a kind of very contemporary, borderline abstract comic that's just sort of taking the reader through architectural space. This is kind of begging for a risograph reprint or something, but, we also see, Lawrence Weiner's characteristic textual fragments as well, although not with his characteristic typography. And I don't know if that's Weiner's hand or Mulliken's hand, but nevertheless, this is the rest of that comic here. So it's a very interesting object. Again, I don't know that much about the actual circumstances of its production, other than that it was, produced and published by this gallery as part of a joint exhibition in Switzerland, and I don't know. Anyway, so that's as much as I know about it, but certainly, it's a very, interesting and rare example of artists self-consciously producing a comic book. And again, I think, what we see is this kind of dynamic between the sort of organizational grouping and a more textual kind of narration that animates this book. So that leads finally to the third category of work that I want to talk about, work that deals, and I should probably come up with a better name, but work that deals with seriality, systems, structure, and space. I've mentioned Saul LeWitt before. He's someone who's very influential on a lot of people who we've talked about today. As I noted at the beginning of the talk, LeWitt himself was a big influence early on Adrian Piper. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with LeWitt's work. He tends to work in a very systematic way, and what I was saying about Lawrence Weiner as a conceptual artist certainly applies very much to Saul LeWitt. A lot of his works are based on systems, based on procedures that can be reproduced by other people, like his wall drawings that people still install today based on his instructions. So, a lot of his work tends to have this, this systematic approach to it, drawing lines in four different directions, then overlapping them until you've exhausted every possible combination. That's very typical of Saul LeWitt's work. And, one wouldn't necessarily see an element of sequence there. It's really more just like a collection, like these are all of the possibilities here. At the same time, there are elements in Saul LeWitt's work that have this sense of progression. This here, it's a photographic work that's obviously going from some kind of, overexposed to underexposed image that we see here, or, what appears to be a kind of similar close-up on a textured surface, again, going from light to dark. There's also an homage to Muybridge that he produced called Schematic Drawing for Muybridge, where we have this figure, this nude walking figure approaching the picture plane, essentially. So we start with a very small image of the figure and end with a close-up on the navel. And it's not just a zooming in, but also if you look closely, you can see the legs of the person moving back and forth from image to image. He also produced a book called Autobiography. But again, it's tempting to want to read this as a kind of photo comic. The autobiography is just a series of images of things in his environment, but really they're organized in groups. It's images of things in his life based on categories, like books or mail or whatever, shoes and so on. So again, these could be reshuffled. They could be read in any order. But nevertheless, he did see narrative as being important to his work. We're talking about this type of serial or system-based artwork said, serial systems and their permutations functions as a narrative that has to be understood. People still see things as visual objects without understanding what they are. They don't understand that the visual part may be boring, but it's the narrative that's interesting. It can be read as a story, just as music can be heard as form in time. The narrative of serial artworks is more like music than like literature. Words are another thing. Okay, so this idea of narrative separate from words. This is a large piece that was, I don't know if it still is, but it was hanging in the entrance to the MoMA movie theater for a long time. I'm not sure if it's still there, but this, in that spirit is kind of like a large abstract comic strip. I certainly enjoyed the conceit that this was kind of intended to guide us to the narrative space of the cinema room. But anyway, I don't want to dwell too long on on Saul LeWitt's work, other than to kind of, talk about a little bit this kind of tension or dynamic between serial and sequence, or system and sequence, and show work by another artist who's very directly influenced by LeWitt, also talked about their work in similar terms, and that's the artist Jennifer Bartlett. Jennifer Bartlett actually, unfortunately, passed away this year. born in 1941. And what's interesting, among other things about Bartlett that kind of plays into this discussion is that, you know, she was principally a visual artist, but she did also write. In fact, I found work by her, and there's probably more, I certainly haven't dug, I just happened to find this in an issue of Adventures in Poetry, a little magazine published by the poet Larry Fagan. And, you know, the first piece, I don't know if you can see at the very first line in the table of contents of issue number 9 is a piece by Jennifer Bartlett. Then when we go through the rest of the table of contents, we see many New York School people who I talked about in my last talk, people like Joe Brainerd, Kenward Elmsley, and you know, Ron Padgett, and others, Anne Waldman, you know, Peter Sheldall, other people who are part of that circle. We also see other artists, including Gilbert and George and Jim Dine and Glenn Baxter, who actually did draw comics for these little magazines. So we see that, you know, Bartlett is someone who's a visual artist, but also a writer. This is just the piece, just so you can see visually what it is. And in fact, in 1985, published an autobiographically based novel called A History of the Universe. But principally what she's known for are these works that she produced on enameled metal plates. So she very much came out of that, you know, Saul LeWitt school of art making, you know, systematic, geometric, but, you know, she was trying to find her own way. You know, and a lot of artists who were involved in this sort of, you know, systematic conceptual work were working on graph paper. And she wanted something that was durable, but also that where if she made a mistake, she could, you know, wipe it clean and start over. She was actually inspired by subway signs, you know, like the signs that are the metal signs that are attached to subway entrances. So she started using these 1 foot by 1 foot metal plates that you would then have enameled and then silk screen a grid onto. And then that became, and they have, as you can see, 4 holes in the corners so they can be hung on a wall. So essentially she started working within this kind of grid system, you know, using these squares, you know, that are themselves gridded, and then, you know, kind of filling them with small dots of color inside the boxes. And that became her way of working. And she started producing installations that were, you know, serial, certainly, but also I think often quite sequential. This one here is called 1-point plane to 9-point plane. So, you know, we see these little dots and this kind of these little red dots in this gray form that sort of grows to encompass them all. And she talked about her work very much the way Saul LeWitt talked about serial work. She said, the question I was never able to understand was the fight between abstract and figurative art. It made no sense to me. An abstract piece of work like some of Mondrian's evoked in me so many sensations, primarily joy. I remember going to his show at the MoMA. It was like swimming. I swam through it. That's a story to me. My requirements for a story can be brief. I'm going to count and I'm going to have one color expand and dominate the situation. That's a great story to me. Okay, so in a way you can see this work as a kind of abstract narrative, right, of this gray form growing to connect all those dots. And you see this in a lot of her work. There's one that I particularly like called Drawing and Painting from 1974. And again, these are very large wall installations here. And so from left to right, we see repeated over and over again the rendering of this shape, you know, starting with a point, becoming a triangle and a kind of trapezoidal figure and growing and growing. So from left to right, we're seeing that process of drawing. So we've got sequence along the horizontal axis, but then we have sequence along the vertical axis, which is more about painting, about coloration. What color should I use? Should I use an outline? You know, which shade of blue should I use? Should I outline it? Should I fill it in? And then ending with, almost like this representation of the palette, the color palette, the gray and the black and the, light blue and the darker blue. So you have this kind of, vertical sequence and horizontal sequence, the kind of thing we associate with the comics page. Her largest and most well-known work is very hard to show in slide format, but it's a very, very large piece that ran across several walls called Rhapsody that she produced between 75 and 76. For quite a while, it was in the atrium at the Museum of Modern Art. Unfortunately disappeared when they redid the museum and moved things around. But this is basically like a work that takes that type of concept that we saw in writing and drawing and just elaborates it in every way that she can think of. So Rhapsody has everything from, representations of line to representations of color to precision, a kind of system-based precision to more abstract kind of mark. So it really reads like a kind of tour through a mind that's kind of thinking about and experimenting with all of these different permutations of image making with these repeated forms popping up over and over again in different guises while functioning as well within the parameters that she set for herself, working on these metal plates with dots of solid color. Again, this is because it's so vast. It's hard to represent in slide form, but I was fortunate enough to see it while it was still up at MoMA. And you can see other elements of direct sequence in some of the work, like this 1983 piece Pool, which is from a larger body of paintings she did of a garden view. So we kind of see this pool sort of filling up with rainwater and muck over the course of a period of time, or this piece Twins, which was about her friendship with the late artist Elizabeth Murray, that has a much more pronounced kind of text image sort of element to it as well, and is quite readable. I want to talk about just two more artists whose work is also quite installation based, among other things, and who also, could have been in that section having to do with photography and performance. Like I said, a lot of this stuff kind of overlaps, but these artists all are making work for installation, as was Ida Appelbrug. The first one I'll talk about is Lorna Simpson, who's a photographer. And among other things, her work involves a project where she's interested in representing the figure, but not having the figure represented as a very specific kind of character. So, not focusing on the identity of the person in the photo, but rather looking at parts of the person, looking at gestures. Of course, there's a lot here too having to do with the experience of being a person of color in America. Here, what we have in gestures and reenactments is kind of like this almost like a catalog of gestures that are paired up with different situations maybe that these gestures might come from. How Larry was standing when he found out, when Buck was being himself, and so on. He stood by the refrigerator, kind of like these little fragments of narrative paired with these fragmented images of a person who, again, is very much performing. This is not a street photography. These are not snapshots. This is, these are, models posed in the studio. And she's, talked a lot about her work. She's talked about, how in her photographic work, she, for some reason, I've always constructed things within the form of a grid, maybe starting out with whole images, but quickly serializing them and segmenting them into quadrants to make up one entire image. And, she says a lot of other things, and says that the structural format of the work most often pulled toward the serial, implying a time-based structure. And again, she uses repetition in some of the pieces. And I think one of the things actually that's interesting too, even in this piece, is that, you know, we've got something that's kind of like a very standard comics-like series of captioned images, but there is also this sort of slippage between the string of images and the string of text. You know, there's 6 images and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know, captions, you know, so it's not quite this direct one-to-one correspondence. You know, we see something here that's similar as well, where we've got the repeated image of a person's back. You know, with this title, 20 questions. Is she as pretty as a picture, or clear as crystal, or pure as a lily, or black as coal, or sharp as a razor? So obviously, you know, dealing with stereotypes of identity in this kind of color-coded language. This is another piece called Screen One. That has a real 3-dimensional quality. You know, Marie said she was from Montreal, although, and then the person would go around to the other side, she was from Haiti. Okay, so kind of narrative of immigration and of obscuring one's origins. And this is just another piece, Tricks R4. And again, you know, we've got this very interesting kind of arc-like arrangement of images that is certainly very clear, even if it's not, you know, a straight line or a grid. And again, this kind of interesting placement of the text vis-a-vis the images. You know, nevertheless, there's a very clear sequence here. Take aim, use force, the hand slamming on the spoon. You know, do not disturb, be careful. She made decisions based on past experience. And then this image striking a match in a pile of matches, you know, sort of suggesting maybe another show of force to come. Just as a PS, if anyone's in the New York area, there's currently a show of Lorna Simpson's work up at Hauser and Wirth. I haven't been there yet, but I'm planning to go, and these are just a couple of installation shots. So what we have here is, you know, an artist who's working with photography, working with sequence, but at the same time, you know, working with installation. You know, these images are meant to be printed large and installed in very particular ways, and you know, which permits, you know, different kinds of flexibilities in terms of how a visual sequence can work, as we see here, and obviously someone who's also examining issues of race that are related to her own identity. And we can say some similar things about the work of Carrie Mae Weems, who's the last artist I'm going to talk about, also a photographer, someone who, like Dwayne Michaels, came to photography a little bit later in life. Actually, both Weems and Lorna Simpson had both some background as dancers. So that's maybe part 2 where the performative aspect comes in. But anyway, Carrie Mae Weems faced a kind of similar situation to Dwayne Michaels, in that she wasn't really sure what to do with her work. She was also kind of initially, when she was photographing, kind of walking the streets and trying to capture, you know, the perfect moment from reality. And that wasn't really working for her. So what she initially started doing was just taking pictures within her own family in a series called Family Pictures and Stories, right? So that word stories, again, suggests narrative. And then she really brought the performative aspect to her work and started really producing posed images that also incorporated the juxtaposition of text and image. So this image is from a series called Ain't Jokin'. This is, you know, Carrie Mae Weems often appears in her own work, you know, and this is a series that's sort of, it incorporates a number of things, including racist stereotypes or racist jokes. So this image has the figure that we see here in the text. Looking into the mirror, the Black woman asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the finest of them all?" The mirror says, "Snow White, you black bitch, and don't you forget it." You know, this is another text image piece, you know, portrait of a woman who has fallen from grace and into the hands of evil. And that's Carrie Mae Weems herself, you know, sort of playing a character. So again, we've got this, you know, the combination of performance and photography. Again, we also have combination of text and image. And the work that's probably her most well-known work is a series called the Kitchen Table series that she produced in 1990. It's been installed in a variety of different ways. This is one installation, a little dense, from the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. And one of the things that I hope you can see here is there's two types of elements being installed here. One is photography, and the other are these text panels. And these are all meant to be read in a specific sequence. So you're kind of alternating between image, text, and sequence of images. And what the Kitchen Table series, which was all shot in Carrie Mae Weems' home, features her as the main character. All the images are shot from the same point of view with this overhead light. And it basically tells the story of a relationship of this man and this woman, who have their own backgrounds, but then come together, form a couple, and then over the course of the narrative, which, kind of sort of checks in with them at various different phases in the arc of their relationship, talks about difficulties in their relationship, a child who they have together, and then the ultimate dissolution of the relationship. So this is something that's quite legible as a visual sequence interspersed with text elements. I happened to see one installation that was very weird because all the text was extracted and grouped together. And I'm not really sure how that would read. It'd be like getting, I guess, two versions of the story. So you get some textual fragments and then you look at the image sequence, remembering what you've read. That doesn't seem to me as functional as the way it was initially intended to be installed. But anyway, here again, we've got something very, comics-like, kind of picture book-like. Certainly, you've got some of these images that really seem to suggest very tight sequencing, the mother, trying to study and read, the child needing help with the homework and working together at the kitchen table. There's a piece by Carrie Mae Weems that I saw and I think is still installed at the Museum of Modern Art called From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. And this is a large-scale installation of photographs in sequence overlaid with text. These images, this was originally made in 95 to 96 at the invitation of the Getty Museum to accompany an exhibit of early photographs of African Americans. And what Carrie Mae Weems did was she took these images that were originally intended as, documentary images that were, meant to be put to racist purpose, essentially, these kind of, to justify these theories, these pseudoscientific theories about the inferiority of Black people from Africa and their descendants. And what she did was she took these images and she overlaid them with text that's etched onto glass and superimposed over the images. And this text gives the images a very clear sequence. So it says from here, the piece is called From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. So it starts with From Here I Saw What Happened. You became a scientific profile, a Negroid type, an anthropological debate, and a photographic subject. You became mammy, mama, mother, and then yes, confidant. Ha. Descending the throne, you became foot soldier and cook, etc. And it ends with a kind of mirror image of that opening image that says, and I cried. So anyway, that's the last artist I wanted to talk about. I guess before we go to questions, I just wanted to maybe put a little cap on it by offering some thoughts about what all of this work maybe suggests. I mean, certainly, a lot of the work that we saw early on, like by Dwayne Michaels or even Keith Haring, the Keith Haring work, or the Ida Applebrook books. I mean, this is work that's intended for print. Certainly, the Matt Mulliken, Lawrence Weiner collaboration is a publication. But at the same time, some of this work that we see by Jennifer Bartlett and Carrie Mae Weems and Lorna Simpson kind of suggests something else, which is maybe the idea of what does it mean to make a comic for installation. You know, when I remember when I saw this particular piece here at MoMA, you know, and this happened as well when I saw the Jennifer Bartlett Rhapsody piece installed at MoMA as well. I mean, I really had this feeling of almost like, you know, reading like a life-sized comic, you know, and kind of walking around and reading this thing that really didn't lend itself to the kind of, you know, sort of like freedom of movement, magpie looking that most exhibits do, you know, and it almost created this notion of like reading the room. Like, what does it mean to create a comic for space? What does it mean to make something that's readable in space, you know, an installation-based comic? I mean, that's certainly one thing that some of this work suggests, but I think even more, you know, the work that we've been looking at today is quite different than a lot of the material that I talked about in the previous talk, you know, these images that I showed at the beginning. And I think, you know, certainly, you know, a lot of this work as, you know, avant-garde as it was at the time and still is maybe easier to accommodate in a comics context, because I think in more cosmetic ways, as strange as these comics are relative to mainstream comics, these still kind of resemble comics in some, you know, very clear way. I mean, these look like comics. They're just comics of a very different type than was being published at the same time, at least by mainstream comics publishers. You know, this work is definitely sequential, but it doesn't look like comics. And often it's doing things with sequence that are different from what we expect, even sometimes from you know, independent comics, you know, but you know, one thing that I think is useful is, you know, in a way to look at something like this Lorna Simpson piece and compare it to like the Roy Lichtenstein piece, you know, and what you kind of see is, you know, in a clearer way here is that there's some work that looks like comics, and certainly the Roy Lichtenstein piece looks like comics, but the Lorna Simpson work acts like comics. It's performing the formal operation that is fundamental to comics in a way that the particular, you know, drawing style or subject matter of the Roy Lichtenstein piece is not. You know, and certainly too, looking at the work of these artists, you know, we see artists working with a lot of different materials, materials that maybe we don't always associate with comics, like cut vellum or enameled metal plate, or, you know, large, you know, photographs with etched glass on top of them. But even, you know, in the context of works that are, you know, a little closer to publishing the way that we recognize it, you know, certainly with like the Ida Applebrook pieces, I think one of the things that we see is that there's an interesting use of repetition, for example, as a form of sequence, where again, it's maybe less about creating a sense of time and more about maintaining the reader's focus, you know, going back to that idea that, you know, maybe comics fundamentally are about structuring the reader's attention. You know, I mean, certainly these also raise questions, you know, they because the work is unconventional within a comics context, you know, that kind of fuzzy border between, you know, the you know, what we might call the array or the matrix, or, you know, the collection of permutations versus sequence, you know, becomes something that's interesting to think about, you know, and, you know, how much sequence is sequence, you know, and I think one of the other things I, you know, take care to note too, looking at the particular body of work in this presentation is that certainly the last body of work that we looked at from 1945 to 1970 was, you know, even though there were a lot of queer artists included, like Jess Collins and Joe Brainerd, nevertheless, it was, you know, almost like wall-to-wall white men, whereas this body of work features certainly a lot of women and women of color, and people of color making work that speaks to issues that weren't represented previously. And that's a kind of interesting thing to think about too, because when we're looking, thinking about this period, particularly the 1970s, and when we're thinking about comics, even when we're thinking about alternative comics, it's a period where we, now look at it and say, well, people of color were really underrepresented in comics. And yet, whatever you want to call that, this period, the postmodern period or whatever, certainly when pop art broke that stricture against narrative and figurative work, when different art forms started interacting and influencing one another, what we see is a lot of artists telling stories, and certainly, people like Adrian Piper, or Lorna Simpson are not inclined to obey aesthetic orthodoxies imposed by institutions that historically would have ignored or excluded them. So that's kind of an interesting thing to consider as well. So, there's a lot of aesthetic diversity here, diversity of material, but also diversity of the people producing this work. And going back to that question too of, something acting like comics versus something looking like comics, the more the material is different, the more something's going to act like comics in a different way, because it's not, ruled lines on paper, it's something else. So I think, at the very least, I know that I'm, very self-consciously recontextualizing work that comes from a lot of different contexts. But at the very least, I think any artist who's really interested in comics and anyone who takes comics seriously would look at this work and find, I think, a useful set of references that I think are very inspiring in suggesting a lot about what maybe still remains to do in the comics field. There's probably more that I can say, but I'll stop there because, gosh, it's 9:03. And I see that a couple of people seem to be posting in the chat. So there might be some questions coming up. So I'll just stop it right there. Thank you very much for your very kind attention. And I'll turn it back over to Austin.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was brilliant. And I'd actually like to start off with a question, and then I'll turn it over to the first question I see in the chat. But one thing that I'd like to just to kind of zero in on your definition of what avant-garde comics means. When we, maybe in the way that movements are caricatured, when we think of art movements, we tend to think of the people within the movement being very aware of what other members in the movement are doing or reactions to past movements. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, and then if we think of comics, we tend to think of maybe people in underground comics or the alternative comics movement as being very aware of the medium's past, their place in it, their reaction to it, and their peers within that reaction. I'm wondering, with these figures, how aware you think they are of each other and how much they're building on what they've done, or if at all.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I mean, certainly both Adrian Piper and Jennifer Bartlett were very influenced by Saul LeWitt, who I think comes up a lot, and I think is a foundational figure too, would have been for Lawrence Weiner and Matt Mulliken. I know, as was suggested by that Dwayne Michaels quote, the type of sequence he was doing at the time was very unusual when he started doing it. And, given that Lorna Simpson and Carrie Mae Weems, even though their work is very installation based, they are identified as photographers. So I would think at the very least that anyone doing anything like a photo sequence would at least be aware of Duane Michael's work, even if they didn't necessarily discover it before maybe arriving in a similar place. But beyond that, I think, I don't know. I mean, I do think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing here is, to some extent or another, a kind of like, maybe increasingly distant, like vibrational after effect of pop art, sort of giving artists a kind of permission, to explore sequence and narrative and things like that. I don't know. I mean, they're all, I think one of the things that all these artists have in common is that whatever category we put them in, they're fairly idiosyncratic. I think they're all individually hard to classify very precisely. Again, it's like, okay, Lawrence Weiner is a conceptual artist. I mean, that's such a broad term. It can apply also to Jennifer Bartlett and Adrian Piper and quite a few others, and they're all doing very different kinds of work. Duane Michaels is an unusual photographer. I mean, Keith Haring, what is he? I guess, we call him a painter, or maybe like a, I don't know, second generation pop artist or so, I don't know, like, he's not really a street artist. So I think all of these people are a bit idiosyncratic, and we're all, Tom Phillips, I guess he's like a book artist, they're all kind of idiosyncratic, I would say. So I don't know. I mean, I think all of them share kind of within their respective fields a kind of independent streak.
I'm going to ask Jonathan. He's first in line to ask a question from the audience, Jonathan Bass, and he asks to unmute to ask his question.
All right.
Let me just, I think you can unmute.
Yeah. Yes, I think I'm going through. Hey, Austin. Hey, Bill. That was great.
Hello.
A lot more awesome stuff to look at that I've never seen before. So that was really exciting. Thank you. So I guess I want to sort of build just my question on what Austin said and sort of on your response in the, so I really had one thing, but then when Austin and you were responding to Austin, I was just thinking, like one thing that would be interesting to think about though, is, I don't know, like Rosalind Krauss, the art critic historian, like her expanded field diagram that she did for sculpture in the expanded field, and that's been picked up. I think George Barker did photography in the expanded field, and they have things like that where instead of trying to like put things into categories, you develop categories through these different tensions between things like architecture and landscape, then gives you a certain kind of sculpture. I was just wondering, so that seemed to be like a way to at least diagram the kind of space that you're working with. So where you have artists who are fairly remote from comics and yet produce, in their backgrounds, and perhaps overt interest, but then produce works that can be read with certain features of comics in them. And then on the other hand, people producing comics, which then sort of have. So my first question was like, if you sort of doing that kind of, I guess it's like semiotic diagramming. Not that I'm encouraging it, but if you're curious, that was something that came to mind in your discussion. The other part of my question, again, maybe relates to what Austin said, in the sense of how these artists understand what they're doing and represent what they're doing in relation to comics, and really what you think about that, because Weiner and I suppose Mulligan as well. I mean, they produce the Crack of the Dawn as it's market. I mean, it's a €100 art book, but it's still produced and as a comic book, and Weiner says, you know, I made this comic book with Matt Mullen. We teamed up on it. We did a comic book, and so that's something that's very consciously sort of invading or representing themselves as doing something in comic space, whereas all the other figures, I think, wouldn't. You know, you sort of document some of that, where you know, they're surprised, or they're excited, or they're like, I haven't really thought of that. So there are two different positions. So what do you make of that that difference, and what are your thoughts on that difference between when it's done self-consciously as a comic book or presented as such, versus when it's something that you, the spectator, you know, identifies and brings out quite nicely in it?
Right. Yeah. No. So there's that's a lot to respond to, but I think, well, yeah, certainly. I mean, the main reason, for example, I do think one thing you're talking about, it's quite true, is this question of intention. Certainly, almost none of these artists made the work they made saying, I'm going to make an avant-garde comic or whatever, an experimental comic or something like that, you know, which is maybe something that we might see, you know, within the comics field. You know, somebody really in a more kind of overt way experimenting with the form and making a statement about comics by so doing. But whereas, you know, certainly in The Crack of the Dawn is very self-consciously a comic book. And usually I find when artists self-consciously make comic books, they tend not to be that good, because I think they get often the kind of cultural side of comics sort of gets blended with the sort of formal approach to comics, and the main reason why I'm interested in The Crack of the Dawn is because I don't really feel like it does that, other than just the kind of materiality and the four-color process of it. You know, it really seems like it's coming very directly from what they do as artists, but then sort of poured into this new format. Beyond that, yeah, you know, like it's you know, as I said, I mean, what I'm doing here is kind of recontextualizing work in a comics context that doesn't originate in a comics context. I don't know if that answers your question. But certainly, I mean, in terms of what the artists think about what they're doing, yeah, I mean, they all say like different things about sequence, you know, I mean, like, you know, and I tried to indicate that with some of the quotations that I included, you know, like, you know, it's just talking about how, like, yeah, they just seem to arrive at these places because they're thinking about grid systems and structure and seriality or time or, you know, whatever. Or, I mean, I think Jennifer Bartlett, you know, saying, you know, that she thinks of what she makes as stories, you know, well, if you're talking about visual stories, there's certainly no text there. You know, I mean, then that leads you, you know, to a couple of logical places like, you know, picture books and comics. Again, you know, I don't presume that most of these artists were thinking very hard about comics. I think, I mean, Adrian Piper was certainly very specifically using some comics iconography in the form of the thought balloon and the word balloon, which she then kind of modified to kind of harmonize aesthetically with the aesthetic of her photography. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that question. I mean, you know, the only way, I mean, I'm always looking to see what these, you know, if these artists, you know, had something to say that's on the record, you know, that's relevant, you know, I mean, in some cases, you know, for those who are still living, I guess I just need to ask them, you know? So yeah, I mean, I don't want to go out on a limb and speak for anyone right now.
Okay. I'll just say that the looking like comics and acting like comics distinction, I think, is a really helpful one in sort of, at least I think, in approaching questions like that. So that was great. Thank you.
I'm going to ask if there's someone else who wants to ask. I have another question on my list. I have a couple of questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to either just type a question into the chat, or if just you could just make a note in the chat that you'd like to say something. Yes, Maria. Maria, would you like to say this out loud, or would you like me to just read it for you?
You can read it. I think my English not so well.
Okay. Maria asks, hey, did you see the publication on Post Comics organized by Sebastian Conrad? Conrad?
No, I have not. What is it?
Sorry. So it was an exposition in 2019 with some artists like Jorin Gerner, Ilan Manoir, that would play something in an artist, but beyond comics. Mm-hmm. So it was a question if there is some, but they are comic artists also working on the field of arts. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question. Is it a post-comics? It was I will find the link and send it here.
That would be great. Yeah, no, I'd be curious to look that up. I mean, certainly I know Ilan's work, and you know, there's you know, I think as I was suggesting before, you know, like when you look at some of this material, like Saul LeWitt, it raises those questions of, you know, is this, you know, is this comics? You know, is it even worth talking about this as comics? And certainly there are a lot of people who have a foot in both worlds nowadays. Who are, you know, making comics for publication, also making work for exhibition, whether that's in the context of drawing or installation or some other context. You know, and it's kind of similar to talking about digital comics too. You know, it's that question of like, at what point does the digital medium sort of transform what it is enough that maybe we're talking about something else, or we're talking about like a hybrid form, you know, and certainly that's another way of talking about a lot of things. You know, maybe it's a kind of hybridity, a hybridization. I mean, you know, even, you know, as I was saying, you know, even with the kind of categories I was coming up with, you know, like at the very beginning, just this idea of like, you know, performance plus, you know, printing, or performance plus documentation. I mean, that's like, that hybridity then kind of almost perhaps inadvertently, you might say, leads to something like comics, you know, but it's not so much like Ida Applebrook wasn't trying to make a comic, she was trying to make a kind of performance on paper, right? You know, but then, you know, it's too bad Ben Catcher is not here, because that's practically, you know, his you know, his happy place, you know, the idea of connecting comics to performance. I mean, you know, that's very, I should say that's core, or seems to be core to how he thinks of comics. You know, and a lot of what he's brought to the symposium is involved, you know, some people who will collect paper theaters, or, you know, puppetry or whatever, you know, so, and he himself has worked in collaboration with theater artists to produce, you know, visual theatrical pieces that incorporate comics elements. So anyway, yeah, that idea of like performance plus documentation yielding something like a comic is there. So, you know, it's, you know, you can look at it as a kind of comic, or you can look at it as what it was probably already thought of, which is a kind of hybridity, a hybridization. So then, you know, that raises, I think, maybe the kind of question, Maria, that the conference you're talking about addressed, which has to do with, you know, do you end up with something else if you start blending comics with ideas from, you know, say conceptual art or other areas? If you start blending the idea of comics with, you know, installation in a gallery space, does it create this third thing, or is it just another type of comics? And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, like when I'm teaching students, you know, like when I teach my graphic novels class, we do, you know, we use Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, you know, and you know, and we learn that way of looking at comics, you know, but I also point out there are other ways. There's, thinking of comics as text image. There's also the cultural definition of comics, which is different and varies across cultures. And the kind of great theory of theories that I try to impress on them is that every theory is useful up to the point that it's productive. I think, some of this work you can look at very clearly as a kind of avant-garde comic. Others, maybe you can raise questions about whether or not it makes sense to think of it as comics, but nevertheless, I think it's productive to think of it as comics. I think for people who are interested in comics, it's productive to think of it as comics because, as I said before, it sort of opens up different ways of thinking about comics and what comics can do, how comics can behave, and so forth. So maybe I'd just leave it at that.
It's interesting when you're talking about performance with Appelbrook's work. I kind of like when I looked at them, what it really connects to me is that the early history of comics are so connected to the scale of her work and or the way the characters look in those little booklets. I mean, I thought of like Thimble Theater and E.C. Seeger, where it's like the characters are not, there's not a lot of cropping. There's not a lot of these like cinematic techniques of like close-ups and shading. Mm-hmm. You're kind of just shown the characters performing on a stage, which I feel is how comics initially presented themselves. I do kind of want to maybe, I know everyone's focusing on this, but you put out this this thing at the end of the talk that's so so full of it opens up a lot of discussion. That's what is fundamental to comics idea. And I kind of wonder what might differentiate these artists that you talked about. You were talking about the experience of being able to move around a gallery space, and how that's different than the normal experience of reading a comic. What might differentiate
and different from the normal experience of looking at a bunch of work in a gallery space too.
Right, but that's what I wonder. Like, what if someone, what might exclude to you, and this might get at your definition of what is fundamental to comics. Let's say someone is doing a solo show of their work, and they're not thinking of these as isolated pieces that were made in time for the show. They're thinking that the show itself interrelates, and each piece augments another piece. I'm curious to you what separates these artists from an artist working that way, where you could say, like in this definition, an artist is showing a group of work that if one piece is taken out, the feeling of the show overall is not the same.
Sure. And I mean, and you could also say the same thing about exhibitions that are chronological, where it's like we go from the early work to the late work, and and we've got examples of all the different periods and so on. I mean, is that, I think anytime you try and, and this is kind of going back to what I was saying, regarding like MacLeod and definitions. I mean, anytime you try and define things like that, you sort of hit some walls or find some gray areas or, things, kind of border cases. In this case, though, I think it does go back maybe to that idea of like, there's a kind of, I think in all of the pieces I've shown today, there's a kind of intentionality. Even if they're not thinking of the work as comics, they're definitely arranging pieces in a sequence. The works, it's not as if, like those mythic being sequences, I mean, that text is continuous from image to image, right? Or, I mean, the Ida Appelbrook, I mean, it's a bound book. So the repetition is purposeful. So even if it is the same image over and over again, that's purposeful. Everything I think that we looked at today was devised with that same level of intention. And while certainly, an artist, who makes a bunch of work that they made individually can then, choose an order and arrangement that they want to see it in. I don't know that work was necessarily devised for that reason, or maybe to put it another way, that doesn't necessarily preclude someone else, some curator or someone from presenting it a different way under some other circumstance. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I mean, there are always, at a certain point, you kind of get down to like a very academic distinction, but I think there's something about the intentionality and the sort of structuring of the reader's attention that all of the work that I talked about today at least shares.
Are there other questions from the audience? I know Bill touched on so much. Might be hard to pick a point of entry. You mentioned, Bill, that it's I can't remember the exact wording you just used now, that it's beneficial or it's good for people who make comics or are interested in comics to consider this work. Could you maybe get at a little bit more what you mean, or what maybe more specifically is beneficial?
I don't know. I mean, I think just a lot of these pieces, among other things, just suggest different ways that comics can work, like, again, that use of, I think what am I trying to say? Like, I think, for example, like, one of the things that's kind of interesting is the question of narrative, like, what is a narrative? Is comics fundamentally a narrative art, a storytelling art? And, sometimes I've, like, resisted that idea, but another way of thinking of it is, kind of like that Jennifer Bartlett articulation of, like, well, the story of one color taking over another is a narrative, right? And, so that's one, thinking about, and I think that's very different from, certainly all of the work, I think, that we've seen today. I mean, even the photographic work, most of it, maybe not all, but I mean, it's all very far away, I think, or much of it is very far away from a kind of cinematic sense of what sequence is, that I think is often a default way of thinking about comics, that it's about, time and space and following a character and, and so forth. Whereas you can have a narrative that's in a kind of timeless space, for example. I don't know. I mean, that's maybe one way of answering the question. I do think, I find, like, again, that repetition that Ida Appleberg uses is very compelling. Certainly I think one of the things that most of the artists talk about, which again is very different from a lot of comics, is talking about, to the extent that the work is narrative, it's often usually narrative in a kind of open way. And most of them, from like Lorna Simpson to Keith Haring, as different as they are, and others have talked about how they don't want everything to be super clear cut, so that there is a kind of open space for the viewer to kind of go into it and draw some conclusions. I mean, Ida Appleberg, I mean, she said her works are like little Rorschach tests, or one critic's, writing about those little booklets said, oh, we've all been implicated in the damn performance, right? Because, it's so much of it is what you bring to it, because of all the kind of lacuna in it. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think often, and I do it myself, certainly when I've taught students in a studio class. I mean, you're always kind of pushing clarity, storytelling. But, I think this, the idea of a more open narrative is something that we could take from it. Obviously, there are all of the different visual approaches that aren't informed by the usual cartooning vocabulary, different media. I don't know. Those are just some things off the top of my head.
Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to ask a question? I do think that yeah, the an insistence on clarity is something that comics has defined itself with. That it almost this is not in line with everything you talked about, Bill, but it almost dallying from clarity almost compels you to be defined as avant-garde in comics, which that might be true across mediums more than we might want to admit it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Although I do tell my students that if you're going to be ambiguous, be sure to be clear about
it. one way to, I think, yeah, clarity or vagueness is something that I think is very avoided in mainstream art in general. Does anyone else have a question before Bill has been very generous with his time. But I believe we have time for at least one more question, if someone has one. Well, Bill, that was, I am so glad to have this talk next to the one you gave last season. And I am going to put in the chat again a link to that first talk, just so that people have ready access to it. And I encourage everyone to again look at our calendar of events. We will have an off week. The symposium will have an off week next week. And then we will return on October 18th. And we're going to have another live event at Unnameable Books in Brooklyn with Megan Kelso. So October 18th at 7 p.m. Megan Kelso will be speaking about her new book, and it will be presented at Unnameable Books. But let's take a moment to really thank Bill, not just for his time, but for the incredible amount of work that went into this history and the previous history. And I think together, it's really just a very, Jonathan Bay says, looking forward to part 3, which I agree with. And so thank you very much, Bill. And yes, we do look forward to the spring season starts in January. So you better get to work.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Austin. Thank you, everyone, especially those of you who are still here right now at 9:33. I really, we went like 2 hours last year. I was trying to maybe not go over, but hey, thanks for all the great questions. I really appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions, because this really is a series it's a unity of speaker and audience. So we look forward to seeing you guys at future events. And thank you again so much, Bill.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, Bill. Bye-bye.